only 10% fat and 8% protein. It's soft enough to cut with a butter knife, and yes, I've tried that with sheep brains. They're very soft, even when they've been preserved in formaldehyde and all that good stuff. Grapefruit-sized organ, I'd say it's a little bit bigger. The sheep brains we had were probably grapefruit sized, and our brains are a little bit bigger. Outside of the brain, you have what are called convolutions or folds. You can see those in the picture in the upper left corner of the slide. All right, so learning changes the brain in some ways. So for example, some types of stimulus needs to happen for the brain to start the learning process. As the stimulus is pushed through the brain, it's sorted and processed at several levels, resulting in some type of memory, long or short term, either doing something we already know how to do or we are doing something new. Both of those will get plugged in and figure out how they fit in the memory. If it's something we already know how to do, it's more of a habit. Stimulation is doing something new, and when you're looking at brain scans, it lights them up, telling us something new is going on. Once the task is actually learned, the brain lights up less. Okay, so brain activity by age. So this is talking about development through sensory experiences in the first year. So if you look at the 1 month, you see that it's more blue, green, a little bit of yellow. By the time it gets to the 12th month, it's got all this red. So there's a ton of activity going on in the brain as they continue learning. A resting brain, so one that's not doing any thinking, will look like these. There's 4 different slices of the same brain. Mind you, this is a PET scan, so the people aren't injured in any way. It helps map the cerebral function, and the resting brain, as you can see, shows no hot spots, no red spots, like we did with the baby. Alright, so thinking activity. Increase activity in the stimulated brain using the PET image. We're showing with the red arrow on the bottom left screen and the little bit of red. It's the region of increased activity, and it corresponds to the frontal cortex. So that's where thinking happens. So memory activity, subject is required to remember an image for later recall. So you get increased activity in the brain over here on the bottom right, where you've got these red arrows, showing you the hippocampal formation, and the region of the brain where these arrows are is implicated in learning and memory, where the hippocampus will integrate all that information, including the amygdala. Alright, so the cerebrum. The largest division of the brain is divided into 2 hemispheres, each of which is divided into 4 lobes. Cool picture of the brain. This is actually just a model. You've got the cerebrum on the left and the right. They're showing you the main part of the brain, and then down at the bottom is the cerebellum. This is a picture on your left here of all the different parts of the brain, kind of color-coded. So we'll start with like the frontal lobe. Has executive functions, thinking, planning, emotions. It's kind of the common sense part of the brain. Then you have the motor cortex for movement, then the sensory cortex for sensations, then the parietal lobe for making sense of the world, math, spelling, that type of thing. The occipital lobe is your vision, and then over here is the temporal lobe, memory, understanding, language, those types of things. The skull over here on your left shows the top and bottom jawbone, shows you the mastoid process where bones and ligaments will attach to allow for movement of the mandible. It's just showing you a bunch more things on it. It's still kind of cool. Okay, so let's go more specific on lobes of the brain. Frontal lobe is located deep to the frontal bone of the skull. So deep meaning below. It plays an integral role in memory formation, emotions, decision making, reasoning, personality. We're going to talk about a real cool story in a minute dealing with an event with the brain. So the parietal lobe is located deep to the parietal bone. So these lobes are named after the bones they are under, or vice versa. It senses and integrates the sensations. It deals with perceptual awareness, spatial awareness, where your body is in relation to other parts. The occipital lobe, its primary function is processing, integration, interpretation of vision and visual stimuli. So the occipital lobe has to do with eyesight and information retrieval. Sorry, guys. All right, so the cerebral cortex, the frontal lobe, forehead to the top of the head is the motor cortex. The parietal lobe over here is top to rear, and it's your sensory cortex. Then the occipital lobe, which is in the back of the skull, back of the brain, is your visual. And then the temporal, again, is right above the ears, and that's your auditory. Here's just an inside cutaway view so you can see the different lobes. You have the pons, the medulla, midbrain. These are all part of the limbic system. They're responsible for subconscious things like breathing and thinking, all that good stuff. And then here's your pituitary gland. It's real tiny, but it actually sits inside a bone that they're not identifying here called the sella turcica. Alright, so the cerebellum, which is down here in the hot pink, actually means little brain. And it's attached to the brainstem, which is what this is. It's also involved in nonverbal learning and memory. And if you injured your cerebellum, you'd have difficulty walking, keeping your balance, shaking hands, all that. And the pons helps regulate that as well. So brain plasticity, the ability of the brain to reorganize neural pathways based on new experiences. Persistent functional changes in the brain represent new knowledge. Age-dependent component, so the older you get, the less elastic is your brain. And then brain injuries also affect that. So there are also environmental influences to this neuroplasticity, the elasticity of the brain. If you're in an impoverished environment, not a lot of human contact, your brain does not develop as well. The neurons just don't do anything. In an enriched environment, you get a much bigger change. All right, so this is the guy I was telling you to talk about here in a second, Phineas Gage. He was 25 years old. He was working on the railroad, paving the way for the new railroad tracks. He was tamping iron, meaning he was pounding it. And one of his jobs was to set off explosive charges in large rock in order to break them into smaller pieces. In one of the instances, the detonation occurred prior to his expectations, so he ended up with a 42-inch long, 1.5-inch wide metal rod blown right through his skull. The rod entered his skull below his left cheekbone and exited after passing through the anterior frontal lobe of the brain. So it went from bottom to top. And here's another view. Okay, you'd think that there'd be more damage, but there's not. He never lost consciousness. He suffered basically no pain. He was awake and alert when he got to the doctor. Normal pulse, normal vision, returned to work. And so there were no like physical outer issues beyond the hole, right? However, people said he was no longer Gage. Okay, before the accident, he was capable, efficient, one of the best foremen, well balanced. Afterwards, he's extravagant, antisocial, liar, cussed a lot, got into fights, just really interesting. He also did a stint with P.T. Barnum, the circus people, Barnum and Bailey, and then he died 12 years later. So kind of a rough life. Okay, so within the brain, You have meninges. They're membranes covering the spinal cord and the brain. And there's 3 layers: dura mater, arachnoid mater, and pia mater. We're not going to worry about this too much. Just see the different layers. Here's the dura, here's the arachnoid, here's the pia mater, and then this is your brain tissue in here, and then this is your skull. So with meningitis, you get inflammation of either the arachnoid or the pia mater. If you have a subdural hematoma, so you've hit your head, you've got fluid and blood collecting, it's under the dura mater. And then you have a little bit of a dural sinus when dura mater splits into 2. So here's another way of looking at it. Okay, here's the brain, here's the pia mater, the arachnoid, the dura mater, the bone, so the skull, the periosteum covering the skull, and then the skin. Again, just kind of another way to look at it. So reflex, switching gears a little bit. A reflex is an involuntary and relatively stereotyped response to a specific sensory stimulus. So I found this cartoon. Whoa, that was a good one. Try it, Hobbs. Just poke his brain right where my finger is. Did you guys see that commercial? I think it was for one of those travel sites, and the brain surgeon was like using the patient's fingers to type on the computer, and he was manipulating the brain to do it. It was kind of funny. Pain withdrawal reflex. Hold on one second, guys. Okay. Pain sends a stimulus, right? It travels up the sensory neuron to the spinal cord. It gets processed in the interneuron, and then the information is sent out the motor neuron so the nerves can process. Spinal reflexes have to do with receptors in the muscles, joints, and skin. The neural circuitry, so the neurons, the nerves, is completely contained in the spinal cord. Let's see, brainstem reflexes such as gagging and vestibular ocular reflex, that's vision and hearing issues, follow similar rules as all of these. Sensory neurons, like we said, carry signals from the outer parts of the body into the central nervous system. So they go from the periphery, so from outer edges in to the central nervous system, and then out the motor neurons to cause the action. And the interneurons just connect these various neurons within the brain. So again, another picture, 3 types of neurons: sensory neuron, interneuron, and motor neuron. All right, so somatic versus autonomic, just kind of showing you how the brain works. Somatic nervous system is the one we control. Here's a kind of a visual so you can kind of see where each of these different things occur. So stimulates the flow of saliva is the medulla oblongata. Heartbeat, bronchial, these are the vagus nerve. Then you also have for the sympathetic, pupil dilation, inhibition, so opposites of everything. So the parasympathetic will slow things down, sympathetic speeds things up. Here is another thing: the autonomic nervous system is involuntary. The autonomic, to me, I always think of automatic, so it's just doing its own thing, its own way. The somatic nervous system is voluntary. Part of the peripheral nervous system connects the brain to the motor neurons. And again, we are in charge of this, so we want to walk or move or gesture. Here's just another way to look at it. Sensory neurons, you've got the internal environment circulating through the CNS, and you've got the external environment doing the same thing. Your fight or flight response occurs because the sympathetic system is activated when a person is going into action. The sympathetic system can disturb the autonomic nervous system. Stress can cause digestion to slow down, can increase or decrease the heartbeat in specific situations, and can elevate the blood pressure. So if you're stressed, you can have these things going on. The parasympathetic system restores peace. So parasympathetic, P for para, P for peace. Here again is written. So you had a visual of this, what it did. Now here's a written part of what the sympathetic and the parasympathetic do to these different structures.